All right, welcome everybody to this webinar entitled Securing the Subsea Data Cable Network, Time to Rethink, with a question mark after it. My name is Henrik Breitenbauch. I'm the director of the Center for Military Studies in Copenhagen at the Copenhagen University, and it's my pleasure to be the host and moderator today on behalf of the Safe Seas Network for this exciting webinar. Of course, the truth is that submarine data cables are responsible for transporting almost all of the internet traffic that has an increasing relevance, not only of our private lives through Zoom seminars and emails and workloads with Excel spreadsheets, but also with commercial traffic all over the world. And so the role of these submarine data cables is undervalued, is underappreciated, under-discussed in not just academia, but also in the broader policy world. And that is the reason for why Safe Seas has convened this webinar today. We are here also on the occasion on the fact that a new article has been published of relevance to today's discussions, and we have the authors with us today, Christian Bueger, professor at the University of Copenhagen, and Tobias Liebetrau, a postdoc with Sciences Po in Paris. And then we have a number of other super interesting people with us today who will help us discuss the phenomenon of submarine cables and their relevance in global politics in various ways. We have Tim Walker of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. We have Kaitlin Meredith of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, their Global Maritime Crime Program. We have Stephen Dawe of the European Subsea Cable Association, and hopefully also Daria Shvets of the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. A few words before we kick off. The structure is such that we'll do first a presentation of the argument in the paper. It's good to have something to start us out with. Tobias and Christian will do that for us, and then our four panelists will have a chance to give a short opening statement, a way to kick off the debate, and then we will open up for comments and questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function in the Zoom app to address those questions, comments to the panelists, and I'll do my utmost to make sure that every one of them gets answered. I should also say that the event has been organized by the Safe Seas Network on Maritime Security, and for those of you who don't already know Safe Seas, it's a global research network that produces actionable knowledge on maritime security issues and on ocean governance. If you'd like to know more, please go to the website at safeseas.net, where this event evidently has also been posted. And this event is the first in a series of events running in this year and next year, and is part of the Dawe project funded by the Danish Agency for Higher Education and Science. We're also recording this event, and the video will be made available on the Safe Seas YouTube channel subsequently for everyone to enjoy further on. Please remember also, when you do ask a question, to present yourself, your affiliation, if you have one, in order to make this a good and productive debate. With that, just a quick reminder again, we will first do a presentation of the argument in the paper by Christian Bueger and Tobias Liebetrau of their new article, and then we'll do a round of kickoff statements by our four distinguished panelists. So Tobias and Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you for your efforts with writing the paper, and please enlighten us as to how we can think better about the political implications of submarine cables.
Thank you very much, Henrik. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. Now, submarine data cables are the core critical infrastructure of the digital age. Up to 99% of global communications travels through the submarine data cable network, and that includes emails, flight bookings, and financial transactions. So it is the vital communication infrastructure of our contemporary world, and it will get even more important in the future the more we become dependent on the internet, in particular also cloud storage. The submarine data cable network is perhaps the transnational infrastructure per se, perhaps only comparable actually to the air carrier system or the international shipping system. And the structure, it connects countries, companies, people all around the world. But there's something puzzling about this critical infrastructure, and that is almost invisible. We hardly pay attention to the cable network. It is less often part of a public debate or part of policy-making processes. Why is that the case? As we outline in our study, there are at least 3 invisibilities involved here. And the first one is usually we tend not to pay attention to infrastructures in general. Infrastructures often reside in the background and we only recognize them when they actually fail. So that's the first invisibility. The second one is related to the fact that we're talking about cables. Cables lie underground, so they're even less visible than a street, for instance. But there's also a third invisibility involved, which is perhaps even more vital, and that is the fact that these cables are also out at sea. And we hardly ever pay much attention to what happens out at sea. So this is this general phenomenon that is often called sea blindness. So these 3 factors play the crucial role in this. Now, the argument that we're trying to make is there are severe issues at stake with the cable network. And overall, we think there are 6 core challenges that need more attention. And I here hand over to Tobias to talk us through these 6 core challenges. Tobias, over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Well, I'll start presenting 3 of these challenges, and these are challenges that have increasingly been recognized in the international community. And the first one is concerned with the protection of the cable network from hybrid warfare and terrorism. And in the West, this challenge is usually anchored in sort of a wider geopolitical, strategic, and military discourse of the North Atlantic security community. And it is concerned primarily with Russia and Russian submarines and how Russia navigates in various oceans facing the West. So this talks to a fear of large-scale cyber attacks and the growing sophistication of also terrorist groups and the perceived hostility of Russian foreign policy. The second of these challenges is more quotidian and accidental, and it stems from faults caused by natural hazards, being earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, and the like, and the use of oceans. This includes fishing with the bottom contact gear like trawlers and dredges, also vessel anchoring or dredging related to sand and mineral extraction. And here it's important to notion that contingency planning, rerouting, and repair capacities have significantly advanced in the past decade or two. So we rarely see these sort of big outcries when these cables become hit with these more everyday accidents. The third challenge is more of a regulatory challenge, and it focuses primarily on legal governance and legal governance architecture, so to speak. And it relates to undefined law and regulations, to the multi-agency use and thereby responsibility of the cable network and the applicability and implementation of the law of the sea in terms of regulating the subsea cable network. Each of these challenges provide important insights about the vulnerabilities of the submarine cable network and the efforts already undertaken to protect it. Yet these are not the only challenges, and in particular, we think 3 additional challenges need more attention. The fourth challenge that needs more attention relates to governance more broadly, and this speaks to cable governance across local, national, regional, and global scales. So how do individual countries, individual agencies perceive of the threat to the subsea cable network? How do they govern it? How do they build public-private collaboration and partnerships? What is the role of international organizations, the role of standard setting, best practices, and so forth? A fifth challenge then concerns vulnerable states in particular. And the states that are vulnerable are those that have little cable redundancy, are in remote locations like island states, have weak regulatory and law enforcement capacities, or contested sovereignty. And to mitigate these challenges, we point to the fact that additional work could be done in the areas of capacity building, post-conflict development, and the integrating further cybersecurity and maritime security thinking and strategy making. Finally, the sixth challenge is geopolitical, and this challenge taps into the resurgence of great power rivalry and the related technological competition that plays out primarily between the US and China, but also includes other players such as the EU and the tech industry. So here we are talking the rise of China, the role of big tech in international politics, and the increased focus on technological and digital sovereignty across the globe. So the question then is, where does this lead us? And I will hand back to Christian to let him enlighten us on that.
Thank you very much, Tobias. To sum it up, I think there's a strong case to pay more attention to the cables and to think carefully about these 6 challenges. And as Tobias just outlined it, 3 of these perhaps have received much more attention, but questions of broader governance, multi-agency cooperation, vulnerable states, capacity building, but also the geopolitical dimension have received way less attention. This quite obviously then also raises the question, where should the priorities be? Which of these challenges should be prioritized and should come into focus? And I sincerely do hope that our panelists will also enlighten us a little bit in this regard. And thinking about which challenges to prioritize is quite obviously also a question of who should be in the lead in handling these challenges. And quite obviously here we need to discuss whether it should be the private industry or international organizations or national governments that handle these challenges. So I think these are very pertinent issues to be discussed, and I look forward to pick up the challenges and the question of prioritization and who should deal with these challenges in the debate. And that's the moment where I hand back to Henrik.
Thank you so much, Christian and Tobias, for an enlightening and riveting exposition of your very interesting and very productive article. And I would like to personally commend you for writing in it, for presenting it to us in such a useful way. I would like to remind everybody that you have an opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A. One person has already done so. It's a great question, so keep tapping away, coming up with more questions, and we will turn to those after the presentations of the initial comments of our 4 panelists. And Tim of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, Tim Walker, you go first. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Henrik. Thank you very much for asking me to address today's meeting as well. The ISS is partnering with the University of Copenhagen Safe Seas on this Dakan project, so we're delighted to initiate some of the discussions and some of our observations with you all here today. I was inspired by reading Christian and Tobias's paper, thinking of the triple invisibility, the triple discourses that mentioned in the conclusion, and thinking around a rule of 3 to come up with a similar kind of a 3-pronged way of looking at this from a South African perspective. I was settling on the letter R because in terms of things like redundancy, regulations, and repairs, those seem to be some of the major, might call security threats to South Africa. I'll explain why I say that in a minute. But South Africa in general has embraced these new technologies. They've often sort of, especially in the 1990s, with the growth of cellular technology and the use of things like cellular banking, had a revolutionary effect on many political and socio-economies throughout Africa, but there's still often a lack of capacity, and it's still not often as cost effective to do business, or rather in effect, we're still very dependent. And South Africa in particular is a fascinating case study, especially when you see a historical backdrop of South Africa's long-term positioning of itself, but also the perception of it as the gateway into not just the Southern African region, but also potentially Africa as in general. If you see it, if you follow, perhaps thinking of the cable landing sites in South Africa, these submarine cable lines, but think of South Africa as the landing site and the launch pad for initiatives. That most of things have come out of South Africa into Africa, whereas here with submarine cables, the inverse is actually happening. Most of the cables are stopping off in South Africa as their final point, or South Africa is not really the hub as such for the cables to be, in terms of media transmission, in terms of all sorts of things carried by them into the rest of Africa. It's this very interesting, like I say, traditional media dominance of a traditional kind of infrastructural dominance, which is worth following up on. If you go throughout most African countries, you'll pick up DSTV, which is from a South African company called MultiChoice, which has for a long time, but that's now increasingly changing, and the relations are built around that, not often, I think, well understood. I think it's really important as well, when you look at the situation from the African continent, to consider that a lot of the investments being made now, even if they are not very cost effective, or often sometimes are being almost future-proofing of companies for the future, is because Africa is the site of a huge youth bulge, or youth dividend, as it's often called in the future. A lot of the investments are targeted 10, 20 years down the line. So that's something worth paying attention to when we see, for instance, that Facebook and various African partners and consortia are building huge submarine cables. I mentioned redundancy or perhaps resilience is a good word as well, in the sense of South Africa being at the end of multiple numbers of cable, over 14 cables, but nevertheless a breakage somewhere further along the line still has an impact which is very hard to fix. Which is why it's quite interesting to focus on the repair angle. South Africa is well positioned in that regard to be the hub for repair companies. There's a company called Martech Marine who are very influential in recovering, for instance, recycled cables, who are headquartered in Cape Town, and various other companies as well who are well positioned in that regard. So that seems to be where South Africa itself is positioning, and understanding some of the issues or security issues going forward. And I think it's very important to note that in terms of the triple discourse in Christian and Tobias's paper, security of infrastructure, I think it's often more the fact that it's the technical and legal aspect, or rather the what's having cable security enables you to do economically and socially, which is the key interest. I think in terms of the dependency of Africa on these networks, that if there is a geopolitical threat, it will not involve Africa, but Africa will be affected quite badly. The final thing I'll just say is that some of the major threats, it would seem, to the resilience and integrity of cable networks and the smooth operation of them is going to be determined by better mapping, better hydrography of African cables are sited, or future ones are going to be laid. A very good example occurred earlier this year. I can share the link once I finish speaking, but it was reported on the BBC and many other stations that there was this colossal, what they called a sediment avalanche, or we just call a mudslide, in the Congo Canyon, which stretches 1,000 kilometers out to sea from the mouth of the Congo River. This short-circuited some of the cables operating between Nigeria and South Africa, and it took a while to repair as well. But they wouldn't have they wouldn't have really known about this canyon sediment avalanche if it hadn't been for the cable interruption. So there's this interesting kind of harmony or future collaboration in terms of multidisciplinary studies there, which it's worth looking into. Yeah, so that's it for me for now. I'm looking forward to the discussions, and I'll share that link in the comments now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Timothy Walker of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. Now we turn to Kaitlin Meredith, who's with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, their Global Maritime Crime Program. Kaitlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to provide some comments today, and also thank you for taking the initiative to do this research, as it is shining light on an area needing a bit more investigation. The perspective that I come from is the UNODC Global Maritime Crime Program, where we've been working with some of our member states, particularly around the Indian Ocean thus far, in trying to develop national and regional plans to respond to submarine cable protection and resilience. Just very quickly, from what was sort of highlighted in the research, is in fact what we have very much found on the ground. There is a quite significant amount of sea blindness as it relates specifically to undersea cables, apart from the particular government ministries who are seized of the issue and the private sector operators. But many government actors are not very aware of submarine cables, of their importance, and what their role could be or should be in contributing to their protection. There is also very spotty implementation of the legal regimes that do exist, and that's something that we're quite interested in following up on. But I think that the positive note is that once we do have our initial awareness raising outreach with national stakeholders, there seems to be unanimous enthusiasm in taking some steps to ensure that the cables are better protected. So I think that that's a positive step as we move forward. The states that we work with, some of them I think could be defined as the vulnerable states, as was mentioned in the research, meaning that they have one or only a few cables, and that puts them in a very specific situation. But I think the first point I would like to make is in support of this idea of having a more multidisciplinary and integrated research on the subject. The reason is that from the experience that we have working with national counterparts on the ground is that their desires in protecting their cables are multifaceted. So responses also need to be aligned. They need to be flexible, and they need to be able to balance a number of varying interests, and that can be protecting their existing cables, but also setting up a regulatory environment that might be alluring or welcoming to additional cables. And this is something that that does come up. If a state wants more cables, they need to create an environment that will welcome more cable operators. And it's not necessarily an easy question to resolve. And the other second point I wanted to make is in support of further research on what practical responses could be taken. I think in the work that we do, we often, everyone always relies on the example of what Australia has done to set up their cable protection and resilience structures, and I congratulate them on their excellent work. But I think it would be very interesting as we move forward, moving with some of these vulnerable states, to assess, what are they doing within the resources that they have? What are some innovative solutions, some low-hanging fruit that could be shared amongst other states? And this could be, using existing assets, not necessarily putting maritime patrols out to ensure that there's not a terrorist threat, also as was mentioned in the article, but rather using better cooperation amongst government stakeholders, better cooperation with users of the sea, relying on maritime domain awareness. So really looking at what are some lower hanging fruits. And then I think the final point is again in support of the recommendation in the article about looking more at the legal regimes. There's a bit of discussion in the article about what is the best method. I think from a practical standpoint, it would be useful to look more in depth at what can be done using the current international legal instruments. But I think the other piece of the puzzle is that states do have sovereignty to be working within their sovereign territorial waters and protecting cables, and many states have not taken that step either. And so again, as states continue to take up this issue, I think it would be very useful to sort of track what different states are doing in terms of implementing their legal sovereignty to protect their cables. I'll finish for now, and thanks again.
Thank you, Kaitlin. Thank you for that intervention. Next person up is Stephen Dawe of the European Subsea Cable Association. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henrik. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this very interesting and very important topic. I think my initial views is that from the industry perspective, we fully recognise the and probably leverage to some extent the hidden assets of the submarine cables, because if you don't know they're there, you can't go and look for them. That said, there's a double-edged sword, because there's the responsibility for submarine operators to notify other seabed users of their presence for health and safety reasons, which is one of the sort of dichotomy that the industry operates under. Everywhere the cable is in shallow water, if there's any realistic degree of fishing or other maritime activities, you need to be sure that you've marked your cable so that they can avoid you, and also so that you can save any chance of entanglement, which is to the benefit of the network. I think looking further at this, I think it's very easy for people to overlook that it's not one state that's involved with a submarine cable. And the correspondence between the states is far more relevant to the argument of security than actually just a single state is. I mean, there are examples around the world where many protectionist activities have been taken that actually make cables less secure. If you make special requirements for a cable ship to enter your waters into the EEZ in order to carry out a repair, you create a situation where the time for the vessel to come to the repair is increased, and this increase is to the detriment of the society, because you're denying services of the cable until such time as that repair has been completed. I think another area that is often cited and works particularly well for Australia and does not take into sufficient account the geography. If you try to replicate what the Australian government has implemented, which is extremely good legislation and very powerful legislation to protect the submarine infrastructure, if you try to bring that into, so let's say, just take it into European waters where the density of cables is much higher, but also the other utilization of the seabed is much higher, you would find there would be a lot of resistance from other seabed users. So one size does not fit all in terms of protecting cables and looking at them from that aspect. I think we always have to take that in mind, that there isn't a single solution, that the magic panacea to protecting submarine cables. I think that covers my opening remarks regarding the paper. I welcome the topics that you picked on. I think some of them are not for the industry to solve, and I think I'll finish my comments here for now.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Stephen Dawe of the European Subsea Cable Association. Next person up is Daria Shvets of the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Welcome to you, Daria. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and sorry for joining later, but thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and nice to meet all of you. Let me also introduce several remarks and conclude this part of this seminar. I enjoyed the article a lot, and since I'm coming from the legal environment and looking on submarine cables from the legal perspective, I'm glad that the article also touches and mentions the legal part and the legal regime of submarine cables. As Kaitlin already mentioned, and I find it one of the most important aspects of the legal regulation of submarine cables. This is, I think, the path where a lot of things still can be done. In my research also, I divide all the states, let's say, on the legislation, on the level of the protection and legislation enforced in relation to submarine cables. And there are currently perhaps three groups can be divided. The first one is those states that did not put sufficient efforts to regulate submarine cables so far. Then those that are on the middle level, let's say, that enforce some legislation. There are several legislative acts in force and the implementation as well. And some states like Australia or New Zealand that understand that their economy and generally the connection that submarine cables provide is very, very important, that took a lot of efforts to regulate submarine cables. So I suggest that this is also the way to proceed and to try to make that the majority of states in the world regulate submarine cables on the sufficient level, and the one that is already demonstrated by several states. And there are many good practices and several guidelines that can be followed by other states that were already implemented by, let me repeat myself, by Australia and New Zealand as an example. Also, the article also highlights that the regime and the nature of submarine cables is, and I use this word, a hybrid, complex nature, because there are many stakeholders involved. Governments, private stakeholders, because the majority of submarine cables are owned by private companies or consortium of private companies. And this is also something to be taken into account in the legal regulation as well, that the legal regulation need, and the legislators and then those who enforce the laws need to always bear it in mind, always to keep in mind that the legal regime of submarine cables is of a hybrid regime, let's say so. And one more thing maybe that I wanted also to highlight is that how we can proceed, maybe how we can improve the legal regime of submarine cables, which improvements can be done. And here there are possible ways how to do this the formal way, for example, just to amend the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that partly regulates submarine cables, but does not probably dedicate sufficient attention to cables. This is the formal amendment. Also, there are instruments of soft law that can be introduced also. But again, in my opinion, and this is, I think these ideas are also maybe are expressed in the article, that everything shall be accounted in a whole, like every aspect, every single aspect, every single side of the complex regime of submarine cables needs to be taken into account and be accessed simultaneously. This is these are all my short remarks on mostly on the legal nature, on the legal ground of submarine cables. Thank you again for giving me this work today.
Thank you so much, Daria. I want to give Christian and Tobias a chance to reflect on the comments here first, and then we'll move to some of the questions that have already come up in the Q&A. And please, if you do have questions, I can see that I myself intentionally raised my hand. If you do have questions, don't raise your hand. Ask the questions in the Q&A, and then we'll go through it that way. But first, Christian and Tobias, can we take your reflections on this input and see how it plays up with the framework that you proposed in the article?
Yeah, thank you very much, Henrik, and thank you to all of the panelists. I think there's much food for thought clearly already here. Let me pick up perhaps 2 points only. And the first one is linked to Steve's and Tim's point about the importance of not thinking in terms of one-size-fits-all solutions. And I think there's a particular reason why the Australian example is everywhere. And of course, Australia is indeed a very, very different regulatory environment, not only compared to Europe, but also than the African context. And it's a little bit linked to what Kaitlin was also highlighting in terms of we are looking at very different capacities as well. And I think in terms of the, excuse me, in terms of the particular topics that we haven't paid almost any attention to, then it is actually developing states, or in particular post-conflict states as well, right? If we think about the cables as being the number source of the for the digital economy, I think it's about time that we think about cables in the context of development policies, that we think about cable as one vital component that exactly crosses the maritime security component and the cybersecurity component. We do have a lot of cyber capacity building, we do have a lot of maritime security capacity building, but none of them so far, with the exception of the Global Maritime Crime Program, is really touching on this issue in particular. And then perhaps as a last point, and then handing over to Tobias, I think it is one of the vital questions here. What is it that the industry should be in charge of, and which of these issues are public and then state-driven agendas? And I'm not sure what your position is on in terms of developing the international law. That would be one areas where states then eventually have to lead, but act in the interest of the industry. Over to you, Tobias.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you to all the panelists for the great comments. I'll also make two brief remarks here, and the first speaks to the international legal discussion and the discussion on public-private relations and how that reflects the discussion that exists in the cybersecurity or cyberspace. What do you say? Sort of a world, so to speak, both among academics and practitioners, that they seem to be very similar. So how do we adapt existing legislation to this sort of a new area, being cables or being cyberspace, or do we need to develop new legislation and new forms of regulation? So perhaps there might be something worth looking into there in terms of overlaps and how that hang together. Second thing I noticed is actually something that was not said that much about, or something that was perhaps to some people lacking, and that was sort of the very little focus on the geopolitics part, and perhaps also the threat of terrorist attacks and this whole idea of especially Russian submarines digging down and wiretapping or destroying the cables and this hybrid warfare part, because that seems to be something that the people listening in is picking up on, looking at the Q&A. So there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy there. So perhaps there is something to sort of practitioners, perhaps downplaying this a little bit. This is something that we don't want to talk too much about, perhaps because it's overstated, that it's a bit of fear mongering, and the threat is not as great as it's sometimes portrayed as in the media. Every time something happens, could be one explanation, but at least there seems to be a discrepancy, and that might be worth also considering. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you, Christian. Now we are digging into the rapidly increasing number of questions in the Q&A box. But if you have a question, please do answer it, ask it there, and remember to note your affiliation so we can have a good and productive debate. I'm going to do it this way. That I'm just going to put one question on to Daria in a second, and while she's thinking about an answer, I'll roll up another question for a couple of other people in the panel, and that way we can proceed in kind of different chunks. So Daria, first, Luis Costa Cabral, Commander Atlantic Center, has a question about the legal status, the juridical status of the data cables. As he says, they are in contact with the EEC, the high seas, and other areas. So what is the jurisdiction? And I know you kind of touched on it on your comments already, but it would be nice to have have a clear statement on the unclear status of the jurisdiction. But while you prepare an answer for that, let me tie a knot around some of the other questions that have come, which basically have to do with the security policy character of the data cables. So threats that emanate from them being something that can be tapped, them being insecure as purveyors of data, but also cables that are the infrastructure role of cables, namely that they are in spite of the redundancy in the global network, they are sometimes very frail, and there's a good example of that in your paper, Christian and Tobias. But maybe you, Steve, and you, Kaitlin, would also like to chip in on the security side of the cables. What kinds of phenomena are most prevalent, and what are the things that that policymakers should think of when they look at the cables from a security policy perspective, more specifically? But before we come to that, we'll go back to you, Daria, and look at the legal dimension.
Sure. Let me provide a short remark regarding this and regarding the legal regulation of submarine cables under international law, specifically. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea divides the territory of the oceans into several zones, let's say, and those zones are have different legal status, those that are under national jurisdictions, and though where states have certain rights, and those that do not fall into jurisdiction of any states. Those being territorial sea or archipelagic zone, then exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, the high seas, and the seabed area. And depending on this zone, the convention foresees the different regulation and the volume of rights, let's say, that a coastal state has, and what this coastal state may be doing in the zone. And in this sense, in the high seas, for example, there is the maritime zone that does not belong to any state, right? And here there is a freedom to lay submarine cables, like any state may lay the submarine cables on the submarine cable in the high seas, whether in comparison, for example, in those maritime zones where states have jurisdiction, there the legal regime is a bit different. Okay, and of course, all the states in those maritime zones where they may exercise jurisdiction, they regulate it on national level. This would be the short answer without entering too much into details on legal regulation, just to have to give a brief overview, if I may.
Thank you, Daria, and thank you for making us all smarter on that aspect. In a second, I would like to move on to the issue of whether cables can actually be tapped, and I don't know which one of you can answer this question. I could speculate about Christian and Steve, probably. You are also lifting your hands. So let's go straight to that then. Then we have lined up a number of other security-related issues first. But Steve, if you want to take a poke at this.
I'll try and give it not to give you too much technical detail. But a submarine cable also has a very high voltage component in it, which protects the fibers. So in order to get through a submarine cable and actually tap into the fiber, which is where the data is traveling, you would have to go through the insulator and through a high voltage path, and to get inside the cable to get to the fiber. We don't believe there is any equipment today that would not detect somebody making that event onto a cable. And to add complexity to that for you, you're also trying to do this underwater where water pressure. So the idea of a submarine opening up a hatch and taking a cable into it and then trying to tap into it is rather far-fetched in technical terms. I don't think for 1 second that I would turn around and say a submarine may not be able to detect a submarine cable that's operating, because it will give off a magnetic field from its current. And I wouldn't want to, you wouldn't need to draw too many conclusions as to why they might want to know where those cables are. But you have to, but I would, can I just follow on and say, so doing it in the sea isn't an option. But then on land, these cables are extended in the terrestrial network, where many people forget that once you've come to a cable landing station, the cable and the data is still transits around the country. And you don't know what happens if somebody wants to put up a manhole, open a manhole somewhere and be looking to make a road repair, but they're not. And that's well beyond the grounds of a submarine cable. That's in the terrestrial way, where you have to protect that as well. And the question is, where do you draw the line?
So also an issue of how to define infrastructure and where it begins and ends in various configurations. Kaitlin, you also wanted to have an input on the sort of the intelligence vulnerability of cables.
Let me quickly add to that, because there's also a second dimension to it, which often gets forgotten. Because there's the physical side of the cable, and there's of course also the software side. That is the data that goes through. And let's not forget that the majority of this data is encrypted. And if you're talking to the big tech companies these days, in particular cloud storage operators, then there's much invested into encryption technology. So tapping into it would be the one stage, but then actually being capable to read and understand it is quite obviously the second one. So in that sense, when talking about submarine data cable or data protection, we always need to consider both of these dimensions in the end. But I fully agree also with Steve that perhaps the core sides of vulnerability are the landing stations.
Thank you, Christian. We have a question from Amod Godbole, who asks very specifically about a project on a Pacific island, but also on about a cable in Marseille in France. And both of those questions relate to the role of geopolitics, and so the potential problems with different kinds of purveyors in providing cable access from a geopolitical perspective. I don't know if any one of you would like to join in on that one, sort of the great power politics take on this. What is at stake, and what kinds of issues can we foresee, or which issues are already in play in the debate as it is now? Tobias.
Thank you, Henrik. Yeah, I'll happily add a little bit to that question, in particular the Marseille cable that actually starts in China and goes over land to Pakistan and there enters the sea and then go via Marseille. And as Henrik rightly points to, this taps into a larger geopolitical discussion and a discussion on, to me, technological sovereignty, digital sovereignty. Will European countries, France in this case, will we be relying on Chinese companies, American companies? And this also speaks to the division of state and company, and who is responsible and accountable, and how easily can we make that separation? Because we see the discussion around 5G especially is that we cannot separate the Chinese state and Chinese companies. And if that goes for 5G, and also many European countries have accepted this, not just the US, Australia, and Japan, then does the same follow from cable laying and perhaps other digital infrastructures? On the other hand, and related a little bit to the wiretapping and also the greater geopolitics of this, can European countries rely on US companies then? And how much of a division do we see there? The Snowden revelations made it clear that at least back then, the American intelligence service had quite a strong access to the data centers of many of the big tech companies. According to the companies, that has changed a lot since. But still, that's another perspective to reflect on, especially in the case of Europe and European countries, and how Europe positioned itself in this geopolitical space of technical and digital sovereignty. One small comment on the surveillance part, at least the debate as it has been laid out in Denmark around wiretapping, cables is that it's actually less sort of tapping, so to speak. It's not that you go and put something on the cable that then sort of sucks up the data. It's more that the data is being mirrored when it enters when it enters land and the data centers. So that's how it works allegedly. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. We're moving on to a question by Aaron Honeyball about the role of South Africa as a repair industry hub for the continent. And I can see already now, Tim, that Timothy, that you would like to answer that question.
Yes, I would. Thank you. And
sorry, can I ask you, because I'm not an expert on this, can you ask to explain to the audience what the question is about?
Oh, in terms of being a repair industry hub.
Yes.
Regional standards. Yeah, I wanted to answer it in question because it's a very good question. I'd like to also say, not just for me to answer, but other people too. The way I was going to answer it, and you, Henrik, sorry if it's not directly here, but it is in terms of the kind of circumstantial evidence which I was going to use, which is, I'm afraid I don't have a direct answer for the question about do African states in particular have a regional regime or network or sort of common standard for going about cooperatively repairing these things. The circumstantial way I would address that is by looking at the recent, well, not recent, it was last year, the Wakashia grounding off Mauritius, and looking at how countries cooperate when there is a need to respond to an oil spill or a ship crash or a salvage. Look at the Suez as well with the Ever Given, and those don't exist. So given that, like I say, perhaps more circumstantial way of looking at it, I would say these things don't exist, or they're not nationally legislated upon yet as well, which kind of touches on what Daria was saying, I think, earlier too. The other thing I would just point out, looking at any map of the submarine cable layout, and given what I just said about the Congo Canyon when I was speaking as well, is that the geography or the hydrography of the sea is going to potentially throw up some very strange, interesting, non-linear connections between countries. And I think, Christian, you've mentioned this in the past as well. I think I've got the idea from, about countries you wouldn't necessarily think have a submarine connection. Given that cable can, there's a huge natural barrier at sea, for instance, between two countries or along the way, that the cables have to be routed from another direction, which throws up a very interesting kind of musical dynamic relationship there, which is determined by the layout of the sea. So that's the answer I would give there. And like I say, it's not just for me to answer, anyone else too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. We have another set of questions which comes from a little bit various backgrounds here, which deal with cable vulnerability. So Gottlieb asks whether it's a possibility to cut a cable and deduct in advance who will be affected. And I'd like to transform that question into a broader one that has to do with vulnerability of the cables, because there was another question a little bit above in the Q&A session, which deals with the issue of unmanned vehicles and the proliferation of that kind of technology, whether that also represents a greater threat to undersea cables, and by implication whether that would then increase the vulnerabilities. I noticed in your paper there was an example of one Pacific state that had only one physical cable running to the state, and that they had then a case of it breaking down, and this was of course a national emergency and a clear example of a particular kind of vulnerability in the overall framework. But and I would like to ask this question broadly, but so to all of you. But what are the vulnerabilities of the cable network in total, and what kinds of evolutions have there been, and do you foresee any with new technologies and policies emerging?
Can I try and answer that first, if you don't mind? I think there's on a wider scale, there's a social requirement for the whole world to think about everybody's right to communicate. The economics of putting a submarine cable into a small nation state in the middle of the Pacific greatly exceeds any chance of making a commercial success of that cable. And therefore, it was quite not unsurprising that it had only managed to get one international connection to it. And obviously, in that case, when you try and roll out modern societal use of the internet and of ATM services and everything that runs on a submarine cable and it gets cut, you have a greater impact on that local small economy than you would if one submarine cable across the Atlantic was to go out. And I think that's something that we do need to work about. In previous roles in my career, I've been involved in recovering out of service cables that have finished their economic life in one point and taking them to other less well endowed states, which opens up communications to them at a price that they can afford to partake at. But I think there is a case for the international bodies to bring the finance to make the cables extend to all the parts of the world in order to bring that communication in, or if not through doing it through submarine cables, to make sure that the low Earth orbit satellite networks or various provide economic service to all parts of the world. And without that, you will not get social development.
That's a strong vision. Yes,
if I may maybe quickly add to this in relation to the vulnerability of cables, I would classify those on two types. First, those that are coming from the environment, like natural disasters that can also lead to the cut and to the cable faults, like hurricanes, tsunamis, I don't know, landslides or something like this. And here, maybe the way of improvement would be purely technical, like improving the techniques of covering submarine cables, of burying them, or inventing very, very technical ways how we can handle this. And on the other hand, there is also man-made human-caused hazards, let's say, yeah, and cuts to submarine cables, mostly caused by fishermen, by boats that lift the cable with the anchor. And here the way to proceed is the legislative one, right? Establishing cable protective zones, cable corridors, prohibition of fishing in certain area or something like this, just to maybe separate and classify two types of vulnerabilities, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Kaitlin, do you want to come in on this one?
Yes, thanks. Just to follow up a little bit on the vulnerabilities, and it leads back a bit to the first question, which was related more to the terrorist threat. And just to share a bit from our experiences working with some states who you know, some of them might be vulnerable states or smaller states without resources, island states with very big maritime zones. And I think coming back to the sort of focusing on the human born threats, I think the users of the sea is you know, definitely the most significant problem, and particularly in countries that are not able to properly view or patrol against, for example, illegal fishing vessels that might be using means that would be threatening to a cable. They are not showing AIS, so they might be passing through areas that could damage cables. So that is definitely a problem and a challenge that has come up in some of the countries that we've worked with. And looking more at the terrorist aspect, I think the other angle for some of the states that we've been working with is really looking at the national and regional context. Are there terrorist groups regionally or nationally who might want to use the threat of damaging a submarine cable as a means of creating havoc or influence? So just to provide another sort of dimension of some of the terrorist and criminal aspects that some states are thinking about. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin. Does anyone else in the panel like to jump in on vulnerabilities? Christian?
Yeah, just to continue this point, and perhaps also picking up Tim's earlier point that the world just looks different from the perspective of the cable. And the cable powers, so to say, are very different countries than we usually would expect. I mean, Portugal, for instance, is vital in connecting the South Atlantic. Denmark and the UK are vital in connecting the Northern Atlantic, and so on. And I think it's important to see that the world looks different from the perspective of the cable. And that then also brings us to these weak states, or the states that we call the vulnerable states. And it is, of course, in particular, those countries which have one cable connection, such as was the case with Tonga. One cable is cut, the tourism breaks down. And those are the vulnerable states. And many of them are also countries in a post-conflict situation, think Somalia, Yemen, and so on. And I think there we seriously need to think about capacity building, because for these countries, that is a national security priority. It has to be. And of course, it's different if we're talking about Portugal and Denmark, and there it's in terms of talking about national security, it's a different kind of priority. How likely that a deliberate attack from terrorism is, that's a completely different story. But let's pick out, for instance, one example that is of a state that is very vulnerable, Maldives, right? There has been some terrorism activity in the past, so I think it would be a most likely scenario from this perspective. But then if we are looking at the rationale of the majority of fundamentalist violence, they are largely out for the symbolic targets, for attacking the state or attacking the police rather than the economy per se. And in that sense, Steve is absolutely right when he pointed out towards the beginning, many cables are well protected by being invisible or by the local population not knowing where they are or that they are that important. And that's indeed one of the most fascinating conundrums there when we're talking about cable protection, starting out from having an event like this, how much flashlight and how much awareness for the cables is actually the right one in different countries, such as the Maldives.
Thank you very much, Christian. I would like to encourage all of the panelists also to go into the Q&A and answer some of the questions directly while we're here. And for everyone who's present to ask more questions in the Q&A, also concrete ones that you might get an answer to by the panelists directly, or that we can pick up in the debate. It's sometimes said that law is crystallized politics or coagulated politics, in the sense that law regulates relatively clearly things where we have a political agreement on a topic, and from that, Daria and everyone else in the panel, Tim perhaps, I think we could move towards some of the legal questions that are placed in the bottom of the Q&A, which, for example, the one by Solange Estevez, who writes, given the conclusions on Daria's presentations would go in the direction of amending the UNCLOS also using soft law, have you thought about the possibility of regulating this matter through a new modern and more complete convention dedicated exclusively to submarine cables, replacing also the Convention for the Protection of Submarine Telegraph Cables of 1884? This is a wonderful piece of esoterica for me. Andrea Calderaro asks also whether there are new aspects of the security of the cables that can be regulated by more political regimes. So I'm wondering if some of those who have a legal understanding would like to help us fabulate a little bit about the possibilities of legal regulation, and those of you who are more to the political side would like to think a little bit about possibilities or avenues for political regulation. And in a sense, nothing should be foreign to us. This is a new landscape and new possibilities can open up and many things are possible. You could also, for example, let me just kick this one out before I open up. The idea of mainstreaming is usually an instrument you use when you have a cross-cutting element that you would like to see put into various kinds of political initiatives. So this is also an aspect we could think of. But Daria, let's start off with the specific legal question and then move on to some more political frameworks as to what to do about the problem, if anything.
Well, perhaps I can start with the question in relation to the possibility maybe to adopt the new convention on submarine cables. And indeed, some thoughts exist, some thoughts about the separate convention on submarine cables exist in the international community. And thank you for bringing up this example of the convention of the 19th century dedicated specifically to telegraph cables. I think it was a great achievement for that time, although the convention was not long and maybe not that developed, but it was a really, really great milestone in the history of regulation of submarine cables. As for this question, it needs to be understood that it's not that easy to adopt and draft the text of the international convention, and there are many, many states involved with the different political, economic, social background. And once the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has already been adopted, and there were many efforts put and many efforts were made in order to agree on the text. And it's probably unlikely that in the near future, those efforts of many countries with a different background will be repeated. That's why, although the ideas in the international community exist in relation to adoption of a new separate convention regulating all the aspects, take into account all the stakeholders and all the peculiarities, futures existing around submarine cables. But I would say in the near future, it's unlikely that this convention will be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us an expose of how law, but on the other hand, also politics works, because it's very hard to reach agreement on much in the international realm unless there's a clear joint interest by all the states involved normally. Tim, would you like to chip in on this one or the broader debate? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, no, I completely agree with Daria saying it. It kind of said everything I really wanted to. I'm pretty sure everybody who's looking at when they see the words amending UNCLOS, there's a kind of collective wince at the idea of opening that up and going to so a new subsea convention actually sounds really fascinating. And if it's, like say, the informal processes, the software processes involved in that, a fascinating thing to keep our eyes on. The second thing I wanted to just highlight is in relation to Luis Costa Cabral's other question around larger EEZ states, continental shelves, non-coastal states. I assume by non-coastal you mean landlocked, and it's worth looking at landlocked states' rights of access to the sea under UNCLOS and seeing how that meshes up or meshes with the right to subsea cable kind of access. The reason I say that is a practical example right here in southern Africa right now is that Eswatini, which used to be called Swaziland, is going through a potential revolution, and a lot of the internet is being cut off, which I'm sure we're familiar with, the internet being cut off in many, many places around the world. So do landlocked states have a direct access with UNCLOS, but falling under that to internet access coming from outside? Because it seems that Eswatini's internet access was kind of cut off by, from what I can see, South African companies okaying that, which is, makes a strange thing if it's not a sovereign right to that kind of access. So there's something I think to look under there about the law of the sea and landlocked states with their right to subsea cable access. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that observation. Tobias.
Thank you, Henrik. I just want to pick up on the sort of political aspect of a new treaty, because to me that seems hard to imagine in the present geopolitical environment that that we will see countries like China, the US, Russia, and so forth actually negotiating a treaty on this and reaching a common ground and a conclusion and opening up the discussion. It might risk being captured by this, so there's the risk that it actually sort of will be captured by great power politics and rivalry and take war and so forth. Second, related to this, but also Andreas' question. I mean, tech, trade, innovation policy is increasingly seen as security policy, but of course there is also this domain of trade and legal trade governance to think into it, and actually perhaps entering us to this domain could be a way of dampen the geopolitical stakes and this sort of state rivalry discourse or lens that this is being perceived through at the moment at the top policy level. So perhaps by going into good old globalization values and trade deals is perhaps a way of making progress within the cable governance and cable protection.
Thank you, Tobias. We have been talking a bit about the vulnerabilities, and so the demand side, we've talked about security issues. We also talked a little bit about the supply side, also in your initial comments on the panel, potential for doing more in various aspects. Covering thus the supply side of the equation in a sense. But I'd like to here towards the end turn the attention towards the future and have a common reflection on what the entire debate means for the future of research. What is the next paper that Kaitlin and Tobias should write? What are the initiatives that other researchers could chip in with? What kinds of concerns do you, who have practical responsibilities out in the real world, do you see that you would like to see research to engage with on this account? What are the opportunities, in a sense, of this agenda? And I'm not afraid here to start out by putting Professor Christian Bueger on the spot, as he is one of the world's leading experts on maritime affairs, and then take a tour to any one of you and the rest of the panel who would like to chip in on this.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Let me perhaps first of all quickly come back again to the question of political regulation. And I think what is crucial, first of all, here is information sharing agreements, information sharing concerning failures of cables, but then also concerning repair activities. I think this is to some degree the starting point for any political cooperation over the issue. And there have been some efforts made in ASEAN, for instance, to work towards information sharing agreements. But there's a particular challenge here, quite obviously, because as I said before, seen from the cable, the world looks a little bit different. And because of that, also regional agreements need to look different. So for instance, we would need not an African submarine data cable agreement, but we would need one for the South Atlantic, and we would need one for the Western Indian Ocean, and perhaps one for the Indian Ocean, etc. And these maritime regions, they are not necessarily established corporations. And that's on the one side a large challenge for getting better regulation on a regional level in place. But then on the other side, also an opportunity actually to strengthen these maritime regions, because it turns out that many of these spaces also have other maritime security problems, thinking about smuggling, thinking about piracy, etc. If it comes to the global level, I think the core challenge of the future, in particular if it comes to policy making or diplomacy, even soft law has been mentioned, informal arrangements. A core question there is, what is the appropriate forum? And Tobias has earlier picked up the question on whether it's is this a technology question? Is that perhaps a trade question, as Andrea Calderao was suggesting in the chat? Or is it indeed a security question? I don't think it belongs to the UN Security Council. I don't think it belongs to the International Maritime Organization. I don't think it belongs to the International Telecom Union. So perhaps it is a topic that would call for a new kind of informal forum, whether that's in G7, G20 initiated or something like that. But that is something where I clearly see the need in the future. That perhaps also brings me to Henrik's question. We have outlined these six challenges, and I think the question of governance across regions, across global, as I just mentioned, what is the appropriate forum? What is the right multi-stakeholder setting for this? Is one challenge also for academia, both to study how this is handled right now, but also to make proposals for the future. Kaitlin has mentioned a second one that is very close to my heart, which is the identification of best practices, or perhaps only promising practices, and then use them in capacity building activities that, however, needs to combine the maritime and the cyber. And that's, of course, something that is particularly difficult because you have different capacity building actors involved. So that will be the challenge there. And here I see academia actually calling quite explicitly for that link. So those are certainly two topics that will follow up very closely. Thank you, and I hand over back to Henrik.
Thank you for that, Christian. Who would like to pick up the ball in the end as a kind of also set of final remarks? Whatever you choose to highlight is, in a sense, also the inevitable spur for a future research agenda for anyone involved. Tobias.
Thank you, and well, of course, I agree very much with what Christian just said, as we have discussed this thoroughly. I would like to add, perhaps not surprisingly, a third road, which is this more sort of tech in the global sense, and relating it to great power rivalry and geopolitics, because I think there is no way of circumventing that moving forward, that the discussion on cables, it is embedded in this question of digital tech war, of the US clean cable networks, the EU's focus on digital and technological sovereignty, and that's just unavoidable. And of course, that actually might lead to a more regional approach, a more contextual approach to how to protect the cables, as was said by both Kaitlin and Christian, that this idea of global regulation, or in a way global protection, somehow is perhaps out of sight, and that might spur us to look into these more regional contexts, and also looking again across public and private actors in coming up with ways of protecting the data cable network.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tobias. Would anyone else like a final remark before we wrap up the thing? Not a strong show of hands. That's fine. We can live with that. Oh, Tim, there we were. That's a hand. Please.
Thanks. The final thing, I'll just go back to kind of what I was saying right at the beginning, especially trying to frame this in terms of Africa's political demographic future. Is I mentioned at the start that the growth of cellular technology in Africa in the 90s enabled huge kind of jumps in terms of social changes and economic changes and financial changes. I feel the conversation in a lot of the world is around a transition between, who's doing the providing. Is it a private company? Is it a state-affiliated country? Which state? Whereas for a lot of Africa, like with the cellular kind of revolution, these investments are still just needed to kickstart things. It's not a transition from one to the other so much. So the investments, the capital needed to tap into future African markets or to partner with African markets means that it's those who are prepared to take the kind of risk or the long-term return, which is where the geopolitical side comes in as well, which is where you will see, you know, a receptivity to those who are going to put this kind of infrastructure in place, I think, and later on deal with the questions of, well, what does this mean for the role of the state? Or how does this revolve around privatization? Or is this politically complex as well? I think the need for basic investment and capital is going to dominate a lot of these discussions, which will probably, from a different perspective of a European perspective or a Western perspective, or if it's about Russia or China, won't be a top priority for many African countries as well, and might be seen as an interference or a kind of a unnecessary kind of questions in that regard.
I think that was also a very fitting statement as an end to a super interesting debate. This is a topic that will not go away. Undersea cables are here to stay. I think I can promise you that. It's definitely a topic that attracts both issues that relate to geopolitics, high politics among the great powers, among the advanced economies, but there's also a clear global south dimension of this, and both a political and legal regulatory debate that will continue to grow in the years to come. So there's only left for me to thank today's two presenters on the occasion of the publication of the article, Christian Bueger of the University of Copenhagen and Tobias Liebetrau of Sciences Po Paris, as well as our four distinguished panelists. Thank you so much for chipping in and being part of this. Timothy Walker of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, Kaitlin Meredith of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime of the Global Maritime Crime Program there, Stephen Dawe of the European Subsea Cable Association, as well as Daria Shvets of the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. My name is Henrik Breitenbauch. I've been your moderator today. I'm the director of the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. But this webinar has been hosted by and provided to you by the Safe Seas Network. And if you don't already know the Safe Seas Network, go to the homepage and check out all of the activities where you can see a link, including in the future, to the video of this event. Thank you so much for joining in today, and keep in touch with everyone involved in the Safe Seas Network and keep the debate going. Thank you so much.
Thank you.